Hello friends, and thanks for joining me for this week's Sunday School lesson. I'm Paul Brooks, the adult Sunday School teacher for the North Greensboro Church of God. This video is an aid for lesson number 3 in this unit in our fall quarter. The theme for this unit is the story of the Old Testament. This lesson is entitled Dynasty of Kings Established. This lesson is about the first 3 kings of Israel, the only earthly kings to rule the entire United Kingdom of Israel, all 12 tribes. God was the king over and ruler of the nation of Israel. After Moses and Joshua, he used a succession of judges to govern the 12 tribes of Israel. But the people of Israel and their judges fell into a dark period for the tribes. Without a strong and godly leader like Moses or Joshua, they all fell farther and farther from God. But then God brought forth and anointed Samuel, who became Israel's last and most effective judge. Samuel was also the first of a new generation of prophets. But the people were not satisfied. They had fallen away from God and wanted Samuel to make a king over them so they could be like other nations. This was the beginning of their apostasy, their renunciation of God as their king and leader. Samuel was angry, but God commanded him to give the people what they wanted and to warn them of what they would really get. God led Samuel to find and anoint the first 2 kings, Saul and David. But this story is not a fairy tale of kings and queens and their kingdoms. The nation of Israel got their kings, but they lost their nation as a result, and eventually their land and freedom. The point is that in seeking an earthly king, they rebelled against their heavenly king and father, our God. But God did not abandon his covenant promise to bring an eternal king from the dynasty and lineage of David and the tribe of Judah. God's plan and will was still in place, and God brought us his Son, Jesus Christ, and made him King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Our scriptural passages today are from the Old Testament books of Samuel and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. In these passages, we read about the calling and anointing of King Saul, David, and Solomon. We also learn of their tragedies and failures. The full stories of the 3 kings is recorded in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. The central truth this week is that the dynasty of the kings of Israel prefigured the eternal kingship of Jesus Christ. Our focus is to study the first 3 kings and honor Christ as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. A lesson's in 3 parts, of course. The first from 1 Samuel, we read part of the story of Saul, the first king, in chapters 8, verses 4 to 9 and 19 to 22, and chapters 9, verse 17, and chapter 10, verse 1, we read about Israel's demand for a king. This is the beginning of their apostasy. Apostasy means they're turning away from or renouncing their religion. In this case, they turned from God and sought an earthly king. In chapter 10, verses 17 to 25, we read that Saul, a reluctant king, is chosen. Second, we learn about David, the shepherd king, in 1 Samuel and 1 Chronicles. In 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 1 to 13, we read about David, the king from Judah. In 1 Chronicles chapter 17, verse 1 to 15, we read about and learn about God's covenant with David. Third, we read about Solomon, the builder king, in 2 Chronicles. In chapters 1, verses 1 to 6, and chapter 6, verses 1 to 11, we read about Solomon building the temple. In chapter 9, verses 1 to 8, we learn more about Solomon's kingdom. This video will focus on the context and the takeaways of this lesson. It's a tool along with the daily Bible readings video that was posted on Wednesday this week to complement your study and reading of the lesson scriptures. The people involved this week are the first three kings of the United Kingdom of Israel: Saul, David, and Solomon. Saul was of the tribe of Benjamin, so we know that his tribe is not the one prophesied to be the tribe from which the Messiah will come. Saul's rule ended in disaster after 40 years because of his rebellion against God. Saul was followed by David. David was from the tribe of Judah. David is still venerated to this day as the best and most loved king of Israel. David was succeeded by his son Solomon, who became best known for his wisdom and his foolishness, but mainly for building the temple for God in Jerusalem. Now, this story follows 300 years of leadership of the nation of Israel by the judges who followed Moses and Joshua. Saul became king in 1050 BC, and each of the three kings ruled for 40 years. So here's the meat of the lesson and what it's all about. Now, I still want you to study the lesson and read your scriptures, but again, here's the meat. We're studying the three kings to better understand that God was the real king of the nation of Israel, and that the eternal King of Kings and Lord of Lords would come from the dynasty of the tribe of Judah. These three kings ruled over an earthly kingdom, but Jesus Christ has been given authority by God to rule over an eternal kingdom. Now, God gave the Israelites the king or kings they asked for, but it was to be their downfall. Saul was chosen and anointed by God, but he rebelled against God and met with disaster. David was chosen and anointed by God even before Saul's reign was finished. David committed several major moral errors, but he remained worshipful before God. Solomon, one of David's sons, succeeded him. Solomon asked for and was given great wisdom by God. Solomon began his reign in worship to God and built the temple for God in Jerusalem. But then Solomon fell away from God, at least for a significant portion of his life, but he repented and was restored to God later in life. We can learn lessons from the lives of the three kings and from their relationships with God. So what? Well, God chose the first three kings of Israel, and God continues to choose people to be leaders today. You and I are chosen by God to lead according to His will for us. Remember that these kings, just like us, were human and very capable of failures and successes, common even to humans today. Remember who our true king is. Whereas the king of Israel proved to be unfaithful, Jesus demonstrated pure and perfect obedience to his Father's will. With honor comes great responsibility and opportunity. Whatever opportunities and privileges come our way in life, never cease depending upon God to help us serve Him and others to the best of our abilities. God commands to be our only God and that He have first place in our lives. So what now? We'll learn from the first three kings of Israel to abstain from the sins they committed and follow after their virtues and godly deeds. We should live a Christ-disciplined life. This is the life we must never cease pursuing. Be like Solomon early in his reign and ask God to give you wisdom. James writes in James chapter 1 verse 5, "If any of you lack wisdom, ask of God, that giveth to all liberally, and upbraideth not," in other words, does not shame, and it shall be given to him. Well, be watching for several video posts next week as we continue our Sunday school study of the Bible. The next lesson, number 4, is a united kingdom divided. This is where the United Nation of Israel comes apart. The central truth for this next lesson is that godly people seek the Lord rather than evil counsel. And as always, I pray that God will bless you while keeping you and your loved ones safe.